In this podcast, I will interpret and explain the research article Are Humans the Only Rational Animals by Giacomo Melis and Susana Monsó, published in the Philosophical Quarterly. We will investigate questions regarding rationality and cover topics such as what is rationality and what different versions are there? What is the difference between scientists' and philosophers' view on rationality, and how does rationality relate to belief? And then we'll finally go back to the initial question Are humans the only rational animal? The article begins its introduction by writing in line with the scholaristic slogan Man is the only rational animal. Many philosophers are committed to the view that rationality sets humans apart from other animals. Perhaps this is a good place for you to take a second and think about the question for yourself. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And why? Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and Kant, among others, are mentioned as important thinkers in history who supported the claim man being the only rational animal, and they list Sellers, Dumain, Brandom, and Korsgaard as contemporaries who supported the claim. And in opposition to that argument, they list psychologists and other empirical researchers like Bautista, Dawkins, and Kalsonic. And most of the article follows the opposing arguments of philosophers and empirical scientists. And to clarify, empirical scientists mean any study whose conclusions are exclusively derived from concrete, verifiable evidence. So there's often this conflict between philosophers and empirical scientists, and much of this conflict is due to the fact that the way rationality is seen by philosophers and scientists is different. And it makes sense that they can't agree on an answer if the meaning of the word rationality itself is understood and interpreted differently. And because of this, in order to understand the initial question and possibly come up with an answer of our own, the first question we must ask is what is rationality? So the article begins by going through the varieties of rationality, discussing the concepts of rationality in a diverse context, clarifying the notion that rationality depends on the adherence to what you would call normative standards that allows for evaluation of belief, action, choices, or behavior. The article highlights this sort of shared fundamental principle among different concepts of rationality by emphasizing disagreements that arise when specifying the relevant standards that are there for evaluation. The first variety mentioned is economic rationality by Kalsonic, which claims that behaviors maximizing expected utility are considered rational. And this perspective disregards moral judgment and focuses only on the outcomes, which could potentially even go as extreme as categorizing addictive behavior as rational if they serve to maximize the consumption of that addictive substance. So, from that, we move on to biological rationality, which is kind of similar to economic rationality, but it is focused on the enhancement of biological fitness and it considers anything towards that rational. And this perspective is so broad in its classification that it could include even evolutionary organisms and plants as rational. And this kind of broad perspective means it's not quite relevant for the argument they're making in the article because it is mainly focused on animals and humans. The next variety is intentional stance, developed by Dene, and according to this, behaviors explicable in terms of beliefs and desires can be deemed intentional and subject to rational assessment. And this perspective is so broad that it could include even objects like a thermostat as rational. These diverse perspectives on rationality bring light to the multitude of ways in which beliefs, behaviors, and actions can be evaluated and understood across economic and biological frameworks. These three notions of rationality mentioned share a common trait, which is they focus on behaviors that can be completely explained without reference to mental states. Philosophers, on the other hand, often consider human belief and actions when discussing rationality, and they emphasize the outcomes of individual agency. When we talk about rationality at the personal level, we delve into one's mental life. So if you think of it as three dimensions, you start with personal, then subpersonal, and third, suprapersonal explanations to things. So in the article, they give the example of catching a ball, which involves personal level reasoning based on the agent's beliefs and desires, while physical movements are explained at the subpersonal level without delving into psychological states. Each movement is driven by psychological processes, but not psychological factors. Events like catching a ball can also be explained at the suprapersonal level if you attribute the act to natural selection. So if personal actions can have subpersonal and suprapersonal explanations, these perspectives do not always consider the subjective choices made by individuals in those specific situations. So, this is where actions and decisions can unfold from personal agency. In this dimension, our actions and beliefs are guided by mental representations that shape our worldview and behavior. Thoughts, fleeting mental events, pass through our consciousness, while beliefs, enduring convictions, influence how we perceive the world and act within it. This mental dimension is crucial for understanding human uniqueness and the sense of rationality that philosophers consider essential. It is here that the interplay between thoughts, beliefs, and actions define our individuality and our ability for rational decision making. The article continues by explaining that in the realm of animal rationality, the focus has shifted towards understanding if animals can act for reasons rather than delving into the rationality of their beliefs. So, historically, there's been this hesitation in attributing concepts like beliefs to animals, but the article states that there's evidence which indicates that animals do engage in conceptual thought, which leaves this room for a reevaluation of animal belief and rationality. There are some frameworks that offer an alternative approach to understanding how animals form and revise their beliefs at a personal level. These frameworks suggest that evidence and belief supports are not only determined by the subject's perspective, and this allows for room for mistakes in identifying the relevant evidence. It opens up for an interesting discussion on the rationality of animal beliefs and how it relates to their responsiveness to evidence. So, in the realm of animal belief formation, they explain that philosophers are divided on whether animals are capable of forming beliefs. Some philosophers attribute belief forming episodes to animals, while others are very skeptical. And in contrast to that, in the field of psychology, where the attribution of belief forming processes to animals is generally accepted, although psychologists do not always use terms like belief and desires when discussing animal behaviors, their work typically operates under the assumption that animals can form beliefs based on sensory input. Studies in comparative psychology often assumes that animals have beliefs and desires, especially in experiments testing for mental state attributions and metacognition in animals. And to clarify, comparative psychology is the study of animals in order to understand humans, and metacognition is an awareness of one's thought processes and an understanding of the patterns behind them. These studies work under the premise that animals possess beliefs that they form based on evidence, and they aim to explore aspects of animal cognitive processes related to belief, formation, and understanding. The philosophical arguments against attributing belief to animals have not deterred empirical studies in comparative psychology. The field continues to operate under the assumption that animals have beliefs and desires. And this common ground underscores the ongoing exploration of animal cognition and belief systems in scientific research. So many philosophers and comparative psychologists attribute episodes of belief formation to animals by considering them largely unreflective processes. In these instances, animals respond to evidence without continuously scrutinizing it, basing their evidence on environmental cues without explicitly considering them reasons for belief. So, this unreflective responsiveness to evidence has both positive and negative aspects. Animals may form beliefs based on positive evidence, but can easily update their belief when confronted with counter evidence that suggests a change is necessary. For example, a gazelle may initially believe it is safe to drink water out of the water hole based on a quick scan for predators, but quickly change their mind on this belief if it detects a potential threat nearby. And this would demonstrate the animal's sensitivity to evidence and that's relevant to its immediate needs and surroundings, which would show that they have the capacity for updating beliefs in response to changing circumstances. So, according to the article, there is evidence from a multitude of empirical studies which would suggest that animals exhibit sensitivity to their own and other circumstances, showing an ability to adjust their behavior based on available evidence. Other examples would be wild chimpanzees that give alarm calls when group members are unaware of nearby snakes, or scrub jays modifying their catching strategies based on potential threats. And pigs use mirrors to locate hidden food. Great apes and rats also demonstrate behaviors that indicate responsiveness to evidence, such as double checking food locations and opting out of difficult tests, and even declining memory tests when necessary. These examples support the notion that animals are capable of unreflective responsiveness to evidence, but skeptics of animal rationality may not be convinced by this evidence alone, and because of that, the question arises whether animals can exhibit reflective responsiveness to evidence. And this is sort of considered the true essence of rationality by the strict opponents of animal rationality. The article claims that demonstrating that animals possess reflective responsiveness could challenge the notion that humans are the only rational animals, and that could potentially challenge the claim of even the most skeptical philosophers. Critics of animal rationality could acknowledge that animals exhibit unreflective responsiveness to evidence, but still argue that only humans possess the ability to engage in reflective consideration for their reasons. So, drawing from Korsgaard, the two key aspects of reflective responsiveness to evidence is identified as one, the identification of the relevant evidence as evidence, and two, the assessment of evidence in thought. These aspects are often demonstrated through language, such as in response to simple questions like, why do you believe that this happened? For example, if a person is asked why he believes the next railway strike will be called off, and he responds by citing the information he heard on BBC radio about the railway workers and how their demands are being accepted. Many philosophers associate reflective responsiveness to reasons with the capacity to articulate reasons linguistically. A person's ability to articulate thoughts like, I believe this because of that, shows his metacognitive capacity involving thinking about one's own thoughts. While many argue that language is crucial for this level of reasoning, empirical evidence is inconclusive. Reflective responsiveness to evidence may not necessarily require language, and analytic epistemology explores defeaters like undermining one's ability, which can result in giving up a belief without providing a reason for an alternative belief. This would suggest that reflective responsiveness to evidence can exist independently of explicit language use. And while they do say in the article that the idea that language with metacognition and reflection are interconnected and unique to humans in terms of rationality, and that the argument does hold appeal, they also explain that a deeper examination of reflective responsiveness to evidence suggests that language may not be an absolute requirement, in that this nuanced understanding suggests that reflective responsiveness does not require or rely on language. Then the study explores whether animals can recognize and respond to unreliable sources of information. It aims to identify behaviors that suggest animals attribute unreliability to sources of evidence. While animals may stop following misleading sources, they may not necessarily form thoughts about the source's unreliability. So, the sensitivity to a source's reliability in animals may occur at an sort of unreflective level. And to reach the level of conscious evaluation and respond to the idea that the source is unreliable, animals would require more than just sensitivity to reliability. They would need a cognitive ability that would allow them for reflective thinking about the quality of the evidence and sources. The higher level of cognitive processes goes beyond merely reacting to unreliable information, and it would involve forming thoughts about the reliability of the sources. An animal showing conscious evaluation of a source's reliability would refuse to follow an unreliable source when encountered in a new context. That behavior would suggest that the animal remembers the unreliability of the source and expects misleading information to come from it. A response like that would indicate recognition of the source's reliability, such as behaviors involving identifying evidence and evaluating it as misleading, which would demonstrate reflective responsiveness to evidence. According to the article, no empirical study specifically aimed at assessing whether animals may be able to respond to undermining defeaters has been published, at least so far. But there are studies, while having other research goals, suggest that animals may be able to assess evidence in the way required to respond to these defeaters. So one such study is in Takaoka, a study on dogs. Uh, they created two experiments that looked into how dogs respond to the reliability of informational sources. The first experiment In the first experiment, dogs preferred to follow the trustworthy sources but stopped following the unreliable ones once they experienced them. And in the second experiment, when a new informant was introduced, the dogs followed the new information or the new informant, showing that they reevaluated the reliability of the previous informant. um, and this behavior would suggest that dogs may think in terms of that specific information is unreliable, but this new one we don't know. So, similar findings were actually observed in great apes in a similar experiment set up by Schmidt in 2017. Moving on to the topic of truth and understanding truth and how it functions in varying cognitive demands. For example, understanding how it differs from comprehension. One must simultaneously be able to consider two incompatible possibilities as open. And this is a concept that can be challenging for a young child, particularly the ones under the age of 3. Um, to handle these incompatible representations efficiently, an individual must engage in different cognitive processes. A children's ability to handle multiple mental models is crucial in understanding concepts like negotiation and possibility, and this is something animals struggle with as well. But understanding negation and conjunction, which do not necessarily require considering two incompatible open possibilities, is enough for children to begin revising their beliefs rationally. And some animals may engage in this type of reasoning as well. It is shown in a test with apes regarding reasoning by exclusion. So, in this test, apes were shown food hidden in two places. Then, one place was revealed to be empty, and the apes went to the place that hadn't been proven to be empty without checking it first. So, the apes demonstrated reasoning, suggesting a capacity for this line of questioning. Another aspect is curiosity, which leads to various types of questions beyond reason, such as those about locations, things, events, and times. Not all why questions necessarily seek reasons. Some may be answered with simple explanations, while questions, attitudes are essential for rational beliefs and revision. They don't always define the reflective belief. Then there's the so called normative questions leading to reflective reasons like, why do you believe Labour will succeed in the next elections? Or why have you chosen to be a vegetarian? These prompt individuals to articulate and defend their reasons. Responding adequately entails identifying and reevaluating one's motives, while curiosity may spark such questions. Addressing them involves engaging in reflective thought, and this is commonly considered a uniquely human trait. The article runs off in a multitude of different directions as it tackles the claim, are humans the only rational animals? They differentiate between unreflective and reflective responsiveness to reasons, asserting that animals exhibit the former. They also consider the potential for animals to demonstrate reflective responsiveness by being able to evaluate the evidence in response to thought, particularly through responding to undermining defeaters. Empirical evidence indirectly suggests that animals may possess the capacities, and because of that, they argue that some species engage in reflective responsiveness to reasons, challenging the notion of human uniqueness in rationality and reflection. And to clarify, the article concludes that humans are not the only rational animal.